There is a specific kind of silence that lives inside an old order Amish home. It isn't the absence of sound. It's the weight of things left unsaid, pressed down into the floorboards until the wood itself feels heavy. On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kitchen smelled of vinegar and boiled linen. The sun cut through the spotless window pane, throwing a sharp, bright square onto the linoleum floor. Ruth was sitting at the table, her hands resting on her apron, when a neighbor from down the road asked a simple question. "Ruth, what is your favorite color?" The ticking of the battery-operated clock on the wall suddenly sounded like a hammer against an anvil. 1 second, 2 seconds. Ruth looked down at her hands. Her skin was rough from lye soap, the knuckles slightly red. 5 seconds. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. 7 seconds. She searched her mind, frantic, looking for a preference, a small spark of something that belonged only to her. But there was nothing. 8, 9, 10. 10 full seconds of a suffocating dense quiet she genuinely could not remember. The answer had been buried under so many years of watching, managing, adjusting, and shrinking that the girl who liked things just because she liked them had vanished. That was the moment the ice cracked. It wasn't a loud argument or a dramatic betrayal. It was the realization that she had become a ghost in her own kitchen, a woman who had given away so much of herself to keep the peace that she no longer knew what color to paint the world inside her own head. "My name is Elsie. I grew up Amish, and I left that world behind. What I do here is tell the truth about it, not the version you see on calendars and tourism signs, but the real one, the one that lives inside the houses and the silences." If that's something you want to understand, subscribe right now, because today's story is one I have been carrying for a long time, and I'm finally ready to tell it in full. This is Ruth's story, and I promise you, no matter where you grew up, no matter how different your life looks from hers, some part of this is going to feel uncomfortably familiar. By the time she finally understood what was happening, her husband owned her inheritance, her daughter was already repeating her mistakes, and the people she trusted most were preparing to choose him over her. Yet, she wasn't a victim who didn't see it coming. She was a woman who saw it coming and kept walking toward it anyway, because she had been taught from the very first day of her life that that was what love looked like. Let's go back to the beginning. It was late summer in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Ruth was 17 years old, standing at the edge of a field where the men of her district were raising a new barn. The air smelled like cut hay and fresh timber, and the sky was the deep, heavy blue that only comes at the end of August. The men worked in long rows, their white shirts dark with sweat, lifting beams with their bare hands. And that is where Ruth first saw Jacob Beeler. He was tall, broad-shouldered. He had a way of laughing that pulled everyone around him into it, even people who hadn't heard the joke. When he caught Ruth looking, he didn't look away. He smiled just slightly, just enough. Ruth told me years later that it felt like something settling into place, like a key turning in a lock she didn't know she had. Now I need to stop here and ask you something, because this moment matters more than it seems. Have you ever felt so certain about a person, so completely sure that you stopped asking questions, that the feeling itself became the answer? That is exactly where Ruth was, 17 years old, certain and completely unaware that certainty, when it stops you from seeing clearly, can be the most dangerous thing in the world. In the community where Ruth grew up, courtship was short by design. You didn't spend years figuring each other out. You found someone your family approved of. You got baptized into the church. You married. Love wasn't something you discovered before the wedding. It was something you were expected to build inside it through obedience, sacrifice, and the daily work of keeping a home and raising children. Ruth and Jacob were married 11 months after that barn raising. She was 18, he was 22, and for a little while, everything seemed to be exactly as it was supposed to be. They lived on land that had been in the family for generations. Ruth planted a kitchen garden. She learned to make choufle pie the way Jacob's mother made it, the exact temperature of the iron for his shirts, and the particular way he liked his coffee. Not quite sweet, but not plain either. She kept that house spotless. Floors you could eat off, windows so clean they nearly disappeared. She was genuinely good at being a wife, and she wanted to be. She believed with her whole heart that a devoted wife was her highest purpose. She entered her marriage joyfully, giving it everything she had. Jacob had a temper. It didn't show itself right away. In the early months of their marriage, he was warm. He would bring Ruth wildflowers from the edges of the cornfields, clumped together in his thick hands. He would sit with her on the porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies rise out of the tall grass. He was easy to be around when the days were smooth and the horses behaved, and the weather held. The first time he raised his voice at her, Ruth told herself it was the harvest. The heat had been oppressive that week, the air thick enough to swallow, and he was exhausted. Any man would be short-tempered under that kind of pressure. The second time it happened, she blamed herself. She had brought up a question about the buggy repairs at the wrong moment, just as he was coming in from the barn. The third time, she stopped counting. And that was when she started doing something that would quietly, invisibly consume the next decade and a half of her life. She started trying to prevent it. Now, stay with me here, because this is the part people on the outside so often misunderstand about closed communities. It wasn't that Ruth was passive. It wasn't that she was weak. Ruth was one of the most capable women I have ever known. She could run a massive household without breaking a sweat, manage the family's seasonal accounts with perfect math, deliver a calf in the mud in the middle of a dark November night, and comfort a screaming, feverish child all before most people finished their morning coffee. She was sharp. She was highly perceptive, and those exact qualities, her sharpness, her deep perceptiveness, became the very tools she used to manage Jacob. She quietly stopped serving certain foods that seemed to darken his mood. She made sure the children were washed, quiet, and settled at the far end of the house the moment his boots crunched on the gravel driveway. She planned every meaningful conversation days in advance, turning the sentences over in her mind like smooth stones, cutting out any word that might land wrong, waiting for the precise, fleeting moment when he was rested, fed, and at ease before she dared to raise anything that mattered. Ruth spent years trying to become the version of herself that caused the least friction, and here is the most heartbreaking part of that. It didn't work. It never does. Because when you build your entire life around managing someone else's reactions, you have already surrendered something that doesn't come back easily. The part of you that moves freely, that speaks without rehearsing, that takes up space in a room without measuring it first. But she didn't know that yet. They had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy. Hannah, the eldest, had Ruth's same sharp, dark eyes and the same way of going completely quiet and still when she was thinking hard. Her son Levi was a gentle boy, the kind who brought injured birds home in his coat pockets, hoping they could be mended. And 12-year-old Miriam, the child who would eventually say the words that changed everything, had her mother's quiet watchfulness. Miriam watched her father the way her mother watched him. She had already learned the skill without anyone ever sitting her down to teach it. Those children were learning the way children always learn. Not from what they are told on Sundays, but from what they see every single day. They were learning that when the back door opened in the evening, the whole house held its breath. They learned that their mother's eyes always went first to their father's face, reading the lines around his mouth, measuring the heaviness of his step, deciding what the next few hours of their lives would be. They were learning that the person with the temper was the weather, and everyone else was just trying not to get wet. Ruth believed she was protecting them. She believed that by managing the atmosphere, by absorbing the tension into her own shoulders before it could ever reach her children, she was shielding them. She had no idea she was teaching them instead. When Ruth was 29, her father died. He left behind 40 acres of good, flat farmland. It was modest, unpretentious land, but it was hers. Her name was on the deed. Under Pennsylvania law, that land belonged to Ruth alone, not to her marriage. For the first time in over a decade, Ruth had something that was entirely her own, a tiny piece of the earth that didn't depend on anyone else's permission. Ruth remembered the exact way Jacob looked at her when she told him about the deed. When she explained, gently, carefully, that the land had been left specifically to her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam a hand on the table. He simply looked at her with that expression she knew better than any other. It wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was disappointment. The cold, heavy expression that said she had somehow, once again, failed to understand what love required. Separate property between a husband and wife, he told her quietly, is a sign that one of them doesn't trust the other. He said it once. He didn't need to say it again. For the next 2 weeks, he went completely distant. The warmth he was capable of, the warmth she had been reaching for through the gray fog of her entire marriage, receded entirely. The house felt like ice. Ruth watched herself begin to weigh the physical land against what its absence was costing her daily peace. She would later tell me that the day she signed those papers was the last day she ever truly felt safe. She transferred the deed into Jacob's name. She told herself she was choosing faith over fear. She told herself she was putting the marriage first, the way a good wife should. She didn't understand that she had just cut away her own safety net. Let me ask you something right now. Something I want you to sit with before we go any further. Has someone ever used the language of love, unity, trust, faith, or partnership to ask you to give up something that was yours? Has a request ever been wrapped so carefully in the right words that you couldn't find the sharp edges of it to push back against? Drop the word yes in the comments if you've been there. Because I think more people have stood in that exact moment than are ever willing to admit it out loud. But what Ruth didn't know, what she wouldn't discover until long after the ink had dried, was that Jacob had already begun making plans that did not include her. While Ruth was transferring the deed, while she was choosing faith over fear, Jacob had been quietly visiting a district elder in the evenings. He was consulting him about the grounds on which a wife could be formally removed from a family home if she became, in the community's language, spiritually unfit. He was building a case methodically, piece by piece, the way you build a stone wall when you intend for it to last. When Ruth finally learned this through a letter from a woman who had been present in the room during one of those conversations, she said, it felt like the ground had dropped completely out from beneath her boots. Not just because of the cruelty of it, but because of the math. It meant that while she had been spending every single ounce of her energy trying to save the marriage, Jacob had been calculating his exit. She had been playing a game she didn't even know she was in. And the worst part, the part that truly hollowed her out, was the realization that even if she had known from the start, she might still have stayed. She had been taught so completely that his unhappiness was her problem to solve, that even his betrayal felt like her own failure. After the land transfer, Jacob didn't become kinder, he became less careful. The criticism grew sharper, delivered over the dinner table with the slow, heavy patience of a man who believed his authority was absolute. He told her she was difficult to love, and Ruth, whose entire world was bounded by the gravel road and the church benches, turned those words like knives into her own chest. She didn't think, this man is breaking me. She thought, I must not be praying hard enough. I must have missed a spot on his shirt. The breaking point didn't arrive with a scream or a shattered plate. It came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while Ruth was wiping flour off the counter. Her 12-year-old daughter, Miriam, came home from school, her black bonnet hanging by its ribbons around her neck. She sat on the wooden bench, swinging her legs, and mentioned casually that her schoolmate had been crying because her father had been shouting at her mother. And then Miriam, with a calm, matter-of-fact look that made Ruth's blood run cold, said, I told her she'll get used to it. You just have to learn how to keep him calm. Ruth told me that in that exact second, she felt the kitchen floor tilt beneath her feet. The smell of the rising bread dough suddenly made her sick. Those weren't Miriam's words. They were her own life, spoken aloud by a child who had swallowed the poison without ever being asked to drink it. Ruth had spent 15 years believing she was a shield, standing between her children and the storm. She realized, with a clarity that cut like a razor, that she wasn't a shield at all. She was a conduit. She was handing the blueprint of her own erasing to the next generation, one quiet, well-intentioned day at a time. Looking back on it now, after years of living on the outside, I see the terrifying math of these closed worlds. The emotional price a woman pays for peace is never billed all at once. It's an interest rate deducted from her soul every single morning she wakes up and decides to shrink. To the neighbors, to the ministers, Ruth's silence was beautiful. It was the highest form of Amish womanhood, Gelassenheit, the total submission of the self. Inside that house, however, that beautiful submission was a slow, suffocating death. That evening, before she could even process the weight of her daughter's words, Ruth found herself upstairs in the dark, clearing out the top shelf of a cedar closet. Her hands brushed against something heavy and fabric-bound. It was her childhood Bible, the one with the tarnished brass latch her mother had given her at 13. She sat on the bare floorboards in the hallway light and cracked it open. Between the thin, translucent pages, folded pieces of notebook paper fell out. In the neat, rounded pencil script of a teenager, there were notes written in the margins. Dreams. Plans. A note that said, "I want to learn how to paint the sunset." Another that read, "I want to be someone my children are proud of, not just because I was obedient, but because I was brave." Ruth stared at the smudge of graphite. She didn't cry. She just held the paper against her apron, looking at the handwriting of a girl who had believed her life belonged to her. A girl she no longer recognized. She began slipping away in the afternoons to visit Anna, an old widow who lived at the edge of the district in a small house that smelled of dried peppermint and wood smoke. Anna was a woman who had outlived her husband and her sons, a woman who sat by her window knitting gray wool socks without ever offering a standard scripture to patch over a wound. When Ruth poured out her heart, trembling, describing the weight of the house and the lesson her daughter had learned, Anna didn't tell her to leave, and she didn't tell her to stay. She just looked out at the bare fields and said something Ruth never forgot. "You cannot stop a house from burning by standing in the doorway and swallowing the smoke." Then she turned her clouded eyes to Ruth and asked the real question. "What do you want for your daughters?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Ruth knew the answer instantly. She didn't want them to learn how to keep a man calm. She didn't want them to sign away their inheritance because love was used as a lever to pry it from their hands. She wanted them to breathe, but the community doesn't let go easily. When Ruth's mother smelled the change in the air, the way Ruth stopped nodding during the Sunday sermons, the way her shoulders held a different kind of stiffness, she came to the kitchen. She sat across from Ruth, her face lined with the deep, permanent creases of a lifetime spent enduring. She didn't speak with hatred. She spoke with a desperate, terrified love. "Go back to Jacob," her mother pleaded, her voice cracking as she reached across the oilcloth table. "Pray harder, Ruth. Submit more completely. This is our cross to carry." Ruth looked at her mother's hands, the same hands that had bathed her, the same hands that had never once held a paintbrush or a steering wheel, hands that had given up everything before they even knew what there was to lose. Ruth felt a tragic, tearing friction inside her chest. Her mother wasn't her enemy. Her mother was trying to save her soul the only way she knew how, but Ruth pulled her hands away. "Mama," she said, her voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator, "I can't teach my daughters what you taught me." Her mother stood up. Her face went entirely blank, the warmth draining out of her features like water into sand. She didn't argue. She just turned, her heavy black shoes clacking against the linoleum, walked out the door, and clicked the screen shut behind her. That silence was the most expensive thing Ruth ever bought. Not the land, not the house. The sound of her own mother's footsteps, walking away into the August heat, leaving her completely alone in the dark. The departure didn't happen in the middle of a stormy night. It arrived on a crisp, foggy Thursday morning, while the dew was still heavy on the alfalfa fields. A gray minivan from an outside support network pulled up to the edge of the gravel road. Ruth and her 4 children carried what they could fit into standard cardboard boxes, mostly clothes, a few books, and that old childhood Bible. The transition into the outside world was a series of small, sharp shocks. At 35 years old, Ruth held a blue plastic card with only her name printed on it, her very first bank account. She learned the terrifying weight of a steering wheel under her palms, watching the yellow lines of the highway blur past at 60 miles an hour. She learned to sit in rooms with people who weren't her elders, learning to speak without running her sentences through 12 internal filters, first to see if they would cause a storm. About a year after they left, her oldest daughter, Hannah, walked into the kitchen of their small rented house. Ruth was standing by the stove, watching water boil, humming a tune she had forgotten she knew. Hannah stopped dead in the doorway, staring at her. "Mama," she said, her voice full of a strange sort of gravity. "Why are you smiling?" Ruth blinked, touching her own cheek, unaware she had even been doing it. Hannah looked at her and said, "You look like someone turned a light back on." Jacob remarried within 4 months of their separation being finalized. A younger woman from a neighboring district moved into the house on the hill. When a distant cousin brought the news, Ruth waited for the sharp twist of bitterness, or the hollow ache of being easily replaced. Instead, she felt nothing but a vast, clean stillness. A quiet realization that that particular book was closed and the ink was dry. Jacob got the 40 acres of her father's land. Ruth got her life back. In the end, only one of those things could breathe. Today, Ruth lives in a quiet town not far from the Lancaster border. She has a garden now. A proper one, the exact size she always wanted, where she spends her mornings tracking the growth of heirloom tomatoes and sweet peas. Her daughters visit often. Miriam is 17 now, the exact age Ruth was when she stood at the edge of that barn-raising field. But Miriam is different. She is learning to take up space in the world loudly, joyfully, without ever checking the horizon to see if a man's mood is about to shift. Years ago, when that neighbor asked Ruth what her favorite color was, her mind had gone entirely white for 10 agonizing seconds. Today, if you ask her, she doesn't hesitate. She looks at the soil beneath her fingernails and says, "Green, the color of things that find a way to grow after being kept in the dark for too long." Now, I want to ask you the question I have been building toward this entire video, and I want you to actually sit with it for a moment. What is something you have given away just to keep the peace? I am not talking about something that was violently torn from your hands. I mean something you quietly, preemptively handed over yourself, because you sensed that shrinking would be easier than standing your ground. It doesn't have to be land. It could be an opinion, a dream, a friendship, or a version of your life you decided wasn't worth the fight. What did you give away before anyone even asked? Drop it in the comments below. You don't have to explain the whole story if it hurts. Just name the thing. Because the act of naming it, even once, out loud, does something that years of silence never could. If Ruth's story stayed with you, if something in her silence felt a little too familiar, please subscribe and share this video with someone who might need it today. Not as a weapon to send a message, but as a quiet hand on their shoulder to let them know they aren't alone in the dark. I release new, deeply personal narratives like this every single week, the real stories that live behind the closed doors and the long silences. And to Ruth, if you are watching this from your garden today, thank you for letting me tell this. Ruth spent 15 years believing that her obedience would save her. In the end, it was her courage that did it.